The largest Muslim country in the world isn't Saudi Arabia, and it's not Pakistan or Egypt either. It's Indonesia, a vast chain of islands stretching across the ocean, thousands of miles away where Islam first began. That fact alone feels almost impossible when you think about it. Islam emerged in the deserts of Arabia in the 7th century, rooted in a completely different world of tribes, trade caravans, and early empires. So how did it travel across such an enormous distance, crossing seas and cultures to reach isolated islands that no massive Islamic army ever conquered? There were no legendary invasions, no dramatic battles marking its arrival, and no single moment where everything suddenly changed. Instead, the story is quieter, almost invisible at first glance, yet far more fascinating. Because the rise of Islam in Indonesia challenges one of the most common assumptions about history, that major religions spread mainly through conquest. Here, something entirely different happened. And once you start to uncover the steps behind it, the real story becomes far more unexpected than anything most people imagine.
To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the beginning, when Islam first emerged in Arabian Peninsula and began expanding at an incredible speed. Within just a few generations after the time of Prophet Muhammad, Islamic empires had already spread across vast regions, reaching North Africa, parts of Europe, and deep into Asia. This expansion often came through powerful empires, like the Abbasid Caliphate, which controlled major trade routes and intellectual centers. But when you look further east, towards Southeast Asia, something doesn't quite add up. Indonesia lies far beyond the typical reach of these early conquests. There are no records of large-scale invasions bringing Islam to its shores, no decisive military campaigns that forced conversion. Instead, the region remained dominated for centuries by Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms, deeply rooted in their own traditions and beliefs. This creates a mystery that historians have tried to understand for generations. If armies didn't bring Islam there, and if no empire claimed it through force, then how did it arrive? And more importantly, how did it grow strong enough to become the dominant religion in such a distant and culturally different place?
The answer begins not with soldiers, but with merchants. Men who traveled thousands of miles across dangerous seas in search of wealth. Long before Islam even existed, trade routes connected the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, with Indonesia sitting right at the center of it all. Its islands were rich in spices, rare goods that were more valuable than gold in many parts of the world. Arab and Indian traders regularly sailed to these ports, and after converting to Islam, they didn't just carry goods, they carried their beliefs with them. Unlike armies, these traders didn't impose anything by force. Instead, they built relationships, formed partnerships, and lived among local communities. Over time, their presence became familiar, even respected. People saw how they lived, how they conducted business, and how their faith shaped their daily lives. Islam wasn't introduced as a command, but as something observed and gradually understood. It spread quietly through conversations, trust, and shared experiences. This slow and steady process made it easier for local populations to
That turning point came when Islam reached the people who held the most power, the local rulers and elites. In many parts of Indonesia, kings and sultans controlled not just politics, but also the beliefs of their people. When these leaders began converting to Islam, everything changed, almost overnight. Their decisions carried enormous weight, and their common people followed without question. But these conversions didn't happen randomly. Muslim traders, some of them extremely wealthy, formed close connections with ruling families. In some cases, they even married into royal bloodlines, creating strong alliances that went beyond politics. Islam became more than just a religion. It became a gateway to power, trade advantages, and international connections with other Muslim regions. For rulers, adopting Islam wasn't just a spiritual choice, it was also a strategic one. And once a ruler converted, it created a ripple effect across their entire kingdom. Entire populations began identifying as Muslim, not through force, but through influence and loyalty.
What started as a quiet presence in coastal towns suddenly began spreading inland, growing faster than ever before. And as more rulers followed this path, the balance of power in the region began to shift dramatically.
As Islam gained influence, one of the most powerful forces in the region began to collapse: the Majapahit Empire. This empire had dominated much of Southeast Asia for centuries, representing the height of Hindu-Buddhist civilization in the region. But by the 15th century, it was weakening, facing internal and external pressures. At the same time, new Islamic sultanates were rising, especially in key trade routes like Malacca. These Muslim-controlled states didn't just gain religious influence, they took control of routes that had once belonged to older empires. Trade shifted, power shifted, and with it, influence over entire populations. Islam was no longer just a growing belief, it became tied to economic success and political strength. As the Majapahit Empire faded, Islamic kingdoms filled the vacuum, expanding their reach across islands and coastlines. This wasn't a sudden, but a gradual takeover, driven by changing alliances and opportunities. And by the time the dust settled, the region looked completely different from what it had been just a century earlier.
But one of the most important reasons Islam spread so successfully in Indonesia wasn't power or trade, it was flexibility. Missionaries, especially those influenced by Sufi traditions, approached the region in a very different way. Instead of trying to erase local cultures, they adapted to them. They allowed existing customs, traditions, and even certain spiritual practices to continue, blending them with Islamic beliefs. This made the transition feel natural rather than forced. For people who had followed Hinduism, Buddhism, or older animist traditions for generations, this approach made Islam easier to accept. It didn't feel like a complete rejection of their identity, but rather an evolution of it. Mosques were built with architectural styles that reflected local designs, and religious practices sometimes incorporated familiar cultural elements. This blending created a unique form of Islam in Indonesia, one that was deeply connected to its local roots. And because it didn't demand a complete cultural overhaul, it spread more smoothly than it might have otherwise. But even this wasn't the full story, because another unexpected force was also shaping the spread of Islam in ways few people realize.
That force came from an unlikely place: China. During the 15th century, powerful maritime expeditions led by Zheng He sailed across the Indian Ocean, reaching Southeast Asia and beyond. These voyages weren't just about exploration, they were about establishing influence and diplomatic ties. What makes this even more interesting is that Zheng He himself was Muslim, and many members of his fleet shared the same faith. As they visited ports across Indonesia, they helped establish Muslim communities, particularly along the northern coast of Java. These weren't small, temporary settlements, they became lasting centers of influence. Networks expanded, cultural exchanges deepened, and Islam gained even more visibility. The presence of Chinese Muslims added another layer to the spread of the religion, showing that it wasn't coming from just one direction, but from multiple interconnected worlds. This created a powerful crucible of influence that connected Indonesia to a much larger global system, reinforcing Islam's place in the region.
By the time European powers eventually arrived in Southeast Asia, Islam was already deeply rooted in Indonesian society. Attempts to introduce Christianity did happen, but they didn't have the same traction as earlier movements. By then, Islam had become more than just a religion. It was part of the social, economic, and political fabric of the region. Being Muslim often meant access to stronger trade networks, better alliances, and a shared identity that connected people across vast distances. Over time, this identity only grew stronger, supported by centuries of tradition and community. Today, Indonesia remains the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, a fact that still surprises many people, who associate Islam primarily with the Middle East. But its story reveals something deeper about how influence works in history. Not everything is shaped by war or conquest. Sometimes, the most powerful changes happen quietly, through trade, relationships, and ideas that travel farther than any army ever could.